I'm going to start this with a question. Should we be vibe coding?
Okay. I think in typical engineer fashion, I'm gonna say it depends. Are you just fucking around and trying to see like what kind of interesting things an LLM can fart out so you can play with product ideas? Why not? That's a perfectly legitimate use of vibe coding, of just, hey, I have no technical skills, but I have a product idea and I want to see how that would look in a real app. That's a perfectly legitimate use of vibe coding, my opinion. Now, if you're asking me, are you asking, is that the question? Or is the question, should you and me, Nick and Julian, be vibe coding? Which is a different question. So I'll let you choose or add another variant to the question.
Well, it was a deliberately provocative and open-ended question. What's
Sure.
interesting is that I'm going to answer your question with a question. It's a little philosophical. Would you describe Julian with a computer science degree using a large language model to accelerate or enhance your coding ability? Would that be classified as vibe coding? I would say no.
No, I wouldn't describe that as the way that I deliberately use LLMs. I wouldn't describe as vibe coding because unless the LLM like gets a like pitch perfect one shot where I look at it and I go, I still read the entire thing. Like I read everything that comes out of it. Every piece of the change set that comes out of it, I read and I make sure I understand where everything's fitting. With very, 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 very few exceptions, I end up making manual edits of some kind, or at least reprompting because I don't like the output that I got from it, or doing multiple rounds, which I would describe as, it also depends on definitions of vibe coding, right? Like I would describe that as not vibe coding because I'm still driving sort of the decision making. I'm very granular with how I prompt it, of like very deliberate about like small chunks with very specific choices that I have already made that the LLM needs to abide by in order for me to just accept the output. So I would say no, that is not. If we're trying to come up with a definition, I would say the way that I use an LLM is not vibe coding.
I would agree, but I think that's already an interesting thing to add to the conversation because I think most people that are even paying attention to vibe coding use the term to refer to anybody using any LLM for any coding. And I don't think that's true. I
definitely disagree. If that's the framing for what vibe coding is, I disagree with the framing.
I would say I vibe code not even all the time. I get like a baby version of what you report to me when I do front end. I'm strong enough and experienced enough in front end to the point where like I can imagine an interface in my mind, open up a browser window, run Vite or some other compiler, and watch it live reload as I just write CSS and markup and see the picture in my head come into focus. And that's really been only in the last 5 years maybe, and that has felt like a superpower relative to myself as a designer 15 years ago. Even then, when I ask any LLM to do any front end, it's interesting if I were to graph the job to be done, where on a spectrum of how specific my wants or needs are in the output, the closer I get to strong wants or needs or very specific wants or needs, that's inversely correlated to how useful an LLM is to me. If I kind of don't know, if I'm kind of just like, oh, I've got a loose idea and I really just need like a basic UI to like throw a database table up there and with a button that does something, I'll just vibe code it and it'll spit something out that's workable. And it's not how I would have designed it, but it's like, whatever, it's there, it's fast. I don't need to nitpick the color of this delete button in this backend admin tool that no one's going to use except me, right? But if it's a production thing, when I have a very clear idea of what I want, almost never does an LLM do what I want it to do, no matter what trickery I use to prompt it. So what this raises or pivots into is that's for front end with me. For back end with me, which I'm relatively inexperienced at, and we should talk about here, that I have been very excited, like a monkey with a nuclear bomb. I've been very excited about what I can quasi accomplish on my own in the middle of the night without asking any permission or help of anyone, especially you. And that's not because I don't want to, but because sometimes you're not awake. Sometimes you're otherwise indisposed. And it's not fair for
By the way,
you.
if it's late at night, chances are you can ask me.
That's true.
If it's early in the morning, that's when it's like Julian's asleep.
That's true.
I can't get an answer out of Julian GPT.
Yeah, my proverbial late at night is actually 6:30 in the morning, and I know you're asleep. So I've been able to accomplish a lot of things that I normally would have had to ask you for help on. And to be very, very clear, I love asking you for help, and I think you kind of enjoy helping me. You've been doing it for 15 years now. However, there are some times when I'm getting a weird error in the browser console. 5 years ago, I would have slacked you and asked you to help me debug that. And now I never do that. And that's probably a good use of an LLM because your brain is better used than figuring out that my declared version of Node is incompatible with the library that I'm using, right?
Yeah, sure.
There are other times when I'm working on something that's not mission critical and like, I'd love your input, but like, I'm not going to die if an API for a hobby project isn't optimized. But whenever we've worked together and I've done a PR that includes any back-end work, you've had some reactions. Why don't you share some reactions? You can be as direct as you want.
Let's sort of set the stage for like what's happening here, right? So we have had a couple times now, a couple of different projects that we've worked on together that have involved mostly web technology, like code bases, right? Like one was a Rails code backend with a React front end. The one that we're playing around with now is basically only a backend tool. And with these new tools, Nick has been able to submit pull requests for specific features that we need, which it's evolved over the last year, how we've like moved through this period, right? So it's like,
I'm not sure what you mean, so I think it would be really interesting just for me to hear what you mean by that.
There was a project earlier this year. I also don't know how specific we want to get about the kinds of things we were working on.
I would say if we have clients that have paid us money, let's maybe not name check them. But if it's stuff we worked on, why not? You can say whatever you want.
So we were working on an app that was basically like an organize your kid's birthday sort of thing, right? Yep. Like we were playing around with the idea of how we were going to do it, and we were excited about LLMs and seeing how they would fit into our workflow. So I took the posture of like, so I'm still the technical lead, and Nick is the design lead, but Nick was willing to just play around with the LLM and try to get some features done. My posture was kind of like, hey, you know what? We're just kind of messing around with stuff, and why not just let him try things? And I will just, for the most part, if it works, I'll just hit the merge button on the PRs because I don't have the bandwidth right now to review these things in a super fine grained manner. So I'm just like, you know what? Let's just keep moving. Let's just keep it moving, keep these features rolling out because these are mostly proof of concept anyways. And what I found eventually was when the first round of things was mostly fine. There was like maybe some weird behavior that would pop up every now and then, but it was like mostly okay. Eventually though, there was like, okay, after a first round of features would go out, somebody would say, oh, it would be really cool if you added X, Y, or Z to this particular feature. So not a new feature, an alteration to an existing feature. And I found myself, I'm like, okay, cool. I'll take that and I'll jump into it. And I would feel like the new engineer in a foreign code base because it was like, somebody else, it felt like somebody else had designed the whole thing. And actually it felt like, this is the crazy part, there was only the two of us working on it. It felt like 5 or 6 different people had touched the code.
Interesting.
Because there were like things were done differently in different parts of the code. There was no cohesiveness to what both the sort of like code standards and linting rules for like how do you organize function, how large a function can be, what does the indenting look like, what do you use arrow functions versus like function declarations in JavaScript, like that kind of stuff. And then from an architecture perspective, there were like some controllers would do were very REST based. Others were very like sort of action description based. And there was no unifying sort of framework for how this whole app was put together. Because of how often I just hit the merge button every time Nick submitted a pull request.
Yeah.
And so I felt like I saw one, I had to spend time getting refamiliarized with the code base that I was supposedly already the lead on. And 2, I had to do a lot of rework to make feature alterations work, because there was no, like, sort of, like I said, there was no architecture in place to encompass, well, to basically take into account, like, hey, okay, yes, this works, but we need to if we need to grow this feature in the future, like, there's a prescribed, you know, there's rails you can go down, that fork that you can use, right? The way it was built, it was sort of like, it's kind of spaghetti code.
Yeah.
And so so that was the first thing. And then it made it so that made it so, like, I barely even wanted to, like, speaking, the emotional side of it was like, I barely wanted to work on that code base, because I was just like, every new thing I have to do, I basically have to untangle a bunch of work. And it was like double the amount of work for if we had just done it right the first time.
Yeah, I think a mental model that I had in my mind after talking to you about this was, I got excited because in a normal workflow, like pre-LLM workflow, I might spend 2 days designing a feature as a designer or product person, and specifying it. And then it might take you 5 days to build it, architect it, build it, test it, get it really bulletproof, like get it really, really ready, and merge it and release it, right? And I thought, wow, I can go from 2 days of Nick's time plus 5 days of Julian's time equals roughly 7 days from beginning to release. And in my mind, it was, whoa, I can go 2 days of Nick's time plus 1 day of Nick vibe coding, and we're good. Like we're released. Trick, or the red herring for me, was that it would kind of work. But what I've learned from you over the years is that there's an ocean of delta between something that you click a button and it does kind of what you expect on screen, versus something that's well architected, resilient, maintainable, extensible, and fits into an overall architecture or framework. Very big difference
Yeah.
between those things. So in reality, even though it would go from 2 days of Nick's time plus 1 day of Nick vibe coding, click a button and it does a thing, what really it turned into was 2 days of Nick designing, 1 day of Nick vibe coding, and then almost, if not more than 5 days of Julian fixing the thing that Nick vibe coded. And in the end, we weren't really, like, the delta, if you zoom out, wasn't really that great.
For certain things, it did work that way, right? Like, the first shot was fine because it would work. It's really the subsequent turns after that, right? That would be more difficult and consume more time, because it was just like, it was basically like, hey, I just need to go. The LLM basically goes like, I just need to satisfy this and get it to this point. It doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter how I get there, as long as it does the thing. Yeah. So that was that first project. With our newest project, I've been much more hands-on, specifically with sort of like setting up kind of like the general prompt infrastructure, right? Like setting, like, I regularly update the Claude MD file to, like, make sure that, like, there's some stuff is just primed into the agent every time that somebody tries to use Claude. So anybody who uses Claude code on the code base automatically has that sort of primed into any part of the project that they try to build. And that's helped some. I definitely still, like, even when I'm using it, like, I'm very, very descriptive, and I'm, like, very careful about how I prompt them. And I still run into things where it'll get like 90% of the way there, but I still have to be very, very careful about how tightly I scope it, right? Because if you blow the scope out too big, you end up with it just, like, spinning in circles and then spitting out a bunch of code that looks reasonable on the surface, but then the more you dig into it, the more you start to find, like, oh, this is not anywhere close to what I needed.
Yeah.
And with more agentic workflows, things have started to get a little bit better. Like basically going, okay, you wrote that, now run the linter. Okay, there's bug and stuff coming out of the linter, either from TypeScript or from Prettier or whatever. There's, like, a bunch of different things that you could run that will flag problems with your code. It fixes those, and then you go, okay, run the tests, and then it'll see tests are broken. The tests are one area where it's both a time saver and can be a complete time suck, because, like, I've seen it, like, in the positive case, I've seen it just, like, spit out a really good set of test cases for what I need it for the thing that I'm building. That's like, I think that's probably one of the best uses I've seen for LLMs, honestly, is just being like, hey, I'm building this thing. I have this thing built. I need tests for existing functionality. Look at the functionality and spit out some test cases for me. And generally it does a pretty good job of that. When it tries to fix broken tests, it's more like 50-50. Sometimes it'll just surreptitiously change the test to just be passing, which is annoying. Yeah.
I have a design corollary to this of where LLMs are insanely valuable to designers. Are you familiar with lorem ipsum, the placeholder text?
Yeah.
So for those that don't know,
my preferred is Samuel L. Slipsum.
There's also hipster ipsum. I'm assuming that is placeholder text that is all Samuel L. Jackson quotes. Is that true?
Yeah, and mostly cursing.
Nice.
A lot of cursing.
So lorem ipsum, for those that don't know, is gibberish Latin that graphic designers have been using, as far as I understand it, for decades. This is a pre-digital phenomenon, and it's basically when you're designing a layout of something, before you know what content is going to finally be in that layout, it is very helpful for you to have some placeholder text, usually text, in order to see how text wraps, how it flows, what it does when it goes off of a screen, or when you're doing print design across multiple columns and onto different pages, and you want differing edges to the lines. So it's this gibberish Latin that is put in as a placeholder for text before you actually put the final content in. And in design, especially with software, especially when there's user-generated content, you kind of can't predict at all what people are going to inject into your interface. Right? They're going to put an emoji. They're going to put a number. They're going to put a negative number. They're going to try to paste a meme of a dog. They're going to write a 5,000 word essay. They're going to do all kinds of stuff. And
45 character German words.
Exactly. And that's funny you bring that up because, an early smokescreen tactic, once you design an interface, is fill it with ideal content, fill it with awful content, and then switch it to German and see where all the buttons break or where you need to truncate text and stuff like that. And the point is this: there is a limit to there's a labor limit to how much a designer can really do that. And so in prior use cases where a designer was using fake copy, having an LLM in seconds generate a lot of fake content for you, so that you can see it's never going to be 100% real, but it's one step further in a realish direction than you just making it up on your own or you just slapping lorem ipsum in there. And it helps you spot where your design breaks or where truncation rules need to be added or whatever in a way that's much higher fidelity. So, I'm working right now. I'm doing some consulting on a email product, and right, the old way to do this is you're designing a table view with a bunch of email previews. What do? Lorem ipsum? Get out your glass of wine and creative write 17 table rows. That's going to take you a long time. Do you copy and paste from a real thing, a real UI screenshot or something? And now it's, hey, here's the scaffolding, here's the markup, and I need you to generate 15 or 500 realistic, diverse, varied sets of content that fit into this markup framework. So anyway, that sounds like the design version of it. It can write good tests and catch good edge cases for you.
But if you don't do that and you don't so again, not trying to throw you under the bus.
Do it. It's safe to throw me under the bus after all this time, Julian.
But this new project, I'm much more discerning with the PRs that come through. So yeah. I'm looking at the code and I'm going, maybe it works, but it's definitely not up to snuff for the design of the code base. It doesn't adhere to any of the best practices that we already have established for the code base. So go redo it. And in some cases, it's I go back and forth on whether or not it's helpful to because my whole throw away the context ethos, right? Which I can get into if we want to right now. But
I'm not sure I know what you mean, but we talk almost every day, so I must know. So why don't you expand upon it?
I've been playing with this idea that I may or may not write into a blog post or something. But it's basically the idea that because of how LLMs work, they are next most likely token generators, right? And when I say next most likely, it's next most likely given everything that is in the context window. So if you keep going just adding stuff to context, which means including stuff like, hey, fix this, right? After you've already filled it with a whole bunch of other stuff. That's how you start to get like basically context sort of falling apart on you and the LLM starting to go in circles on itself. Because if you think about like what that means statistically, like the way that the way like this is to be clear, this is also a gross simplification of how LLMs do this. But like if you think about it, like okay, if you have this increasingly long string of tokens that that you've added to that you keep shoving in there, the likelihood that that string of text exists at all is very, very low before you just created it and shoved it into the LLM. And it's going to make it increasingly hard for the LLM to produce quality output because it's going to basically flatten out the distribution of like the next token that's likely.
Yeah.
And so if you keep just shoving things into the context, eventually it's just going to start to output garbage. Even if you have like a million token context window, you can't functionally use that million token context window because for the most part, you'll eventually start to like cause it to basically like fold in on itself. And so like, so I go back and forth on like, so in the case of what we're talking about here, like, so for the PR, I go back and forth between saying, okay, modify this here, I want you to change this in the PR. Do you go to the LLM and say, hey, this is the current state of the code and I'd like you to change this? Or do you go back to the beginning? You go back from the main head of main in your Git branch, in your repo, make a new branch and then start over again with the feedback already incorporated into your original prompt. Which is why, like, I don't know if you remember, like, one of the PRs that you sent recently, I was just like, hey, I'm going to be pretty blunt. I'm just going to say, hey, this is what you need to do, but just stop and redo it. And I think there's something to that because I've definitely noticed, at least in like, even in small turns within my own development workflow, I have noticed that if I just hit, like in Claude Code, if you just go clear, like, hey, if it's not going the way you want it to go, you just go clear, reformulate what you were trying to do into and incorporate whatever things it was doing wrong and what you want to do, and then it'll more likely, you're more likely to get a good output that way.
That is what I do. I reset context often, and I reset context when you have feedback from me. I find that the delta between a really thorough and specific, well-worded Genesis prompt versus trying to course correct a conversation that's already going sideways is really...
Genesis prompt. We should trademark that.
Nice. Versus trying to course correct something that's a conversation that's deep in the weeds already gets subjectively, I think it's better. It has better outputs. I want to test the mental model with you. If I imagine tokens as bullets, which is a violent, I guess, mental model, but for lack of a better word, projectiles, cannonballs are maybe less scary nowadays.
They're still used to sink ships, but
Yeah. If I imagine tokens as bullets, are long conversations stuffed with a lot of context, like a really long and narrow barrel that it's going to really constrain maybe even over constrain the trajectory of the bullet. Whereas if you keep it pretty open, the space of probability of where that bullet's going to land is pretty wide. Am I thinking about that the right way or not? Or is that metaphor breakdown in some...
I think the main thing that the metaphor breaks down, but I think the idea of constraining is the right one. So if you think about it, right, like the more things you put in the context window, the more you're limiting the sort of likelihood that a next token can be predicted accurately, right? Especially if you fill it with nonsense. The extreme case is sort of like just put in a bunch of text that doesn't mean anything, and then it'll have like, 'cause at the end of the day, what the highest level idea of how an LLM works is it's a function where it takes two inputs. It takes the model and it takes the current set of tokens that you have in the context, and then it spits out another token. And then as it's producing content, it'll take that new token, it'll add it to the context, it'll run it through that function again, and then it'll output another token. And the way that it selects that token is basically saying, hey, I'm gonna take my model, I'm going to take this set of tokens, and then I'm going to produce a probability distribution across all possible tokens. So like literally every token that is possible, I'm going to assign a probability to each of them for what I think can come next. And typically when this works really well, you'll get a very, very, very sharp distribution for just a couple of tokens. And then And then if you do a sampling from that distribution, you will most likely get like a good, one of those good, very high probability tokens. Now, what happens if you keep expanding that context and it gets more and more self-contradictory and or it's nonsensical or whatever, that basically that distribution that gets produced for that for that next token starts to flatten out a little bit, right? Maybe you have a little bit of a hill instead.
The probability percentages go down for any.
The probabilities they start to be closer to each other, right? So like whereas you used to have like you would have 99.999% of them near zero, and then maybe 2 or 3 that were up at like 99.99%, like probability. Now you're getting like, okay, maybe you have the outer bounds. If you pictured it as a curve, like you would have like the outliers are like at 20%. And then the ones in the middle, there's like a big lump in the middle of like that are all at like 30 or 40%, and which means that you're gonna select from that distribution, and you might not get a very good outcome for that because everything is kind of closer in terms of likelihood. That's when you start to get like out of distribution for the model, right?
Interesting.
And the longer and the larger the context gets, the more like I don't know that this necessarily scales generally, because to be clear to anybody who might be watching this in the future. I am not a data scientist. I am not an LLM expert. But the longer the context window gets, and the more self-contradictory or nonsensical that the content within the context window gets, the flatter the distribution will get, and the more likely you will be to get garbage output. That's kind of how like context poisoning happens, right? It's like it's just kind of everything kind of falls apart.
Yeah.
The more you shove in there.
I'm curious if you went back in time to meet yourself 10 years ago, let's say, right? It's 2015, you work at Gem, you're building non-custodial cryptocurrency infrastructure, and you meet 2025 Julian, and 2025 Julian is trying to describe to 2015 Julian this technology. Honestly, you're talking to yourself, so you're not like trying to sell yourself, you're not trying to spin it, you're not trying to blow your own mind, you're trying to accurately describe these tools to 2015 Julian. How do you describe them? How do you describe their value? How do you describe their drawbacks? How do you describe how it works? Like, I'm very curious.
I think I would probably describe it the same way I just described it. I don't know if I would believe myself that it actually worked, though.
Okay, interesting.
Like I think that's the part that's most surprising about. I think that's the part that's like really surprising about LLMs, is that if you just describe the mechanism by which they work, the natural intuition is that like, oh, there's no way that actually produces anything useful. But they do, kind of, like for specific things. Like I'm definitely not trying to say that like these things are sentient beings. I'm definitely not on the like these are sentient beings and we're like they're basically just as intelligent as humans. I'm also not like these are completely useless. I'm kind of like they produce surprisingly useful output given the technique that's used.
Yeah.
Also, the jury's still out on whether the trade-off on the amount of compute that it takes to do it is actually economically viable, right? Like, I don't know if the answer to that is yes yet.
May I clarify that really quickly? By that, you mean if some utility we ever got out of LLMs was taking like a long thread of coworker slacks and summarizing it into action items, that's moderately valuable versus reading 5,000 words over your vacation from work. But if it costs $7,000 to do that, it would not be economically viable.
Yeah.
Relative to what you would get paid to just read those 5,000 words.
Yeah, exactly. And like, and the productivity game, like even if you just measured it from the productivity games for engineers, right? Like if I'm, like there's people that are claiming like that they're 10x more productive. Maybe they found something that I haven't, but I haven't found that to be the case for myself. I think I am more productive using an LLM. I also haven't empirically measured that, but I think if I had to like just hip shot what I think it was, I would think I'm like 20 to 30% more effective as an engineer. Now, I'm paying $20 a month for Claude right now. That's worth the $20 a month is definitely worth a 20 to 30% performance boost on how I work. Now, if I was paying 10 grand a month for that extra 20 to 30%, I probably would be like, am I picking that up in extra money from my job, from being more effective? If I better be, because otherwise I wouldn't say it's worth it.
What's really What
And that's the question, right? Like how subsidized are these things, and how much money is it really going to cost once the real cost structure comes through?
Let's be specific about that, though. And let's not use real income numbers because A, I don't know what your real income is at this moment in time, and B, it's not important. But let's just use a round number for the sake of math, right? If someone grosses $100,000 a year in their salary,
Mhm.
and they become 20% more productive, the net gain in economic output of that person, assuming that they're accurately valued, is $20,000 or $1,600 a month. Now, in zero universes, would it make economic or market sense to Indiana Jones golden statue head replace you with a bag of sand? Right? It's like let's churn a bunch of compute and use a bunch of water and a bunch of electricity just to one for one replace 20% of Julian's labor. So there's probably going to be like, what's the rule we use? It's like a factor of 9 improvement that is needed before switching costs are really where
Well,
customer
like yeah,
behavior actually alters.
where the customer will actually decide to, that the switching cost is worth it. It's like if you can improve it by a factor of 9.
Okay, so $1,600 a month divided by 9 is $177 a month. So it sounds like you would be ahead if you upgraded to the $100 a month Claude Max plan. But the minute you went to the $200 a month Claude Max plan, if you are accurately describing your productivity boost, $200 a month doesn't make sense. $100 a month still does, but you're only paying 20. That's interesting. It's an interesting cost benefit analysis. Also, I will say, without forcing you to humble brag, because you're too humble to say this, but it's also, I think, important to be descriptive and accurate about what we're talking about, is you make more money than the average human on the earth, certainly, and the average American, because you're highly educated, deeply experienced, and your area of expertise is something that's in very high demand. So that doesn't also apply to everyone, right? If you're making it also, interestingly, only applies to people in knowledge work at this point, right? You might be able to replace someone whose job it is to write summaries of bills of lading for a shipping company.
That's still not, but that's still knowledge work.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But you can't replace a soybean farmer or a carpenter at this stage for obvious reasons. So there's actually, like, in the sights of economic revolution here, a fairly constrained set of roles. And interestingly, I would love for you to, if you're comfortable, talk about this a bit. What seems to be in the crosshairs right now are junior developers. Like,
Yep.
I've seen some
Yeah.
data. I don't have it prepared to pull up because I didn't think we'd talk about this, but even in the last week or two, there's been some fairly rigorous economic data that says that most of the compression of jobs seems to not be for software engineers writ large, but for early in their career software engineers. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I think, well, that makes sense that that's where the job losses are. And when I say it makes sense, I don't mean that like I agree with the rationale behind why it's happening, but it makes sense just knowing market dynamics and how most tech executives sort of view their workforce. It makes sense for them to say, so that junior engineer that I used to have to compete with everybody for to get, pay them $120,000 a year straight out of college, I don't have to hire them anymore because my mid and senior guys are going to be 20 to 30% more. I also think they're kind of deluding themselves how much improvement their actual workforce is going to get out of these tools immediately. But they're telling themselves, like, let's just be conservative and say it's 20 to 30% per mid to senior engineer. It's like, oh, that, and then if a junior engineer represents 50% of a mid or senior engineer, then just 2 of those guys can pick up the slack of a single junior engineer that I no longer have to hire anymore. So it's like, depending on your ratio, you can basically say, I'm not hiring juniors at all anymore.
What gets really, I'm sorry to interject, but what gets weird here is, in the same way that you said it makes sense. We should clarify, it doesn't make sense in that it's good. It doesn't make sense in that it is just, but it does make numerical and logical sense. In that same way, I think there is an equal but opposite problem and question, and that is, let's be brutal and cynical. Let's say 0 computer science majors ever get hired again, and the mid-career senior architects like you just won the lottery. The ladder just got pulled up behind you, and you never have to worry about job security again. In that world, you will not live forever. The question is, if we've destroyed the pipeline of junior engineers that over time become the mid and senior architects and CTOs and infrastructure experts, if we've destroyed the pipeline, that's a big problem. And I'm curious if you think that's descriptively accurate, and if so, how we fix that.
I think it is descriptively. I think I don't know for sure that it's destroyed yet, but the industry at large is doing a pretty good job of it. Because I haven't been actively hiring in the last year, but from what I've read, the junior engineer market is like abysmal. Like kids are graduating from these top schools with a lot of debt, and nobody's hiring them. And I think that's short-sighted, first of all, for the reason that you just described, right? Is like eventually I'm going to retire at some point. The guys who are a generation older than us are like maybe 5 or 6 years away from that already, maybe 10, depending on how much they want to keep working. So yeah, I guess the bet is that the LLMs are going to get so good that they're just going to replace the seniors too at some point. Which, I mean, it's improving fast, but I just see enough deficiencies in the technique and the outputs that I have a hard time. And given that we already know from what these companies are saying that it's getting much more expensive, like they're hitting diminishing returns on how much it costs to train new versions of these models and get the same amount of improvement out of them. That doesn't that doesn't necessarily mean that a breakthrough couldn't happen where there's a new technique that emerges, but at least this class of LLMs is not going to be it. That's my bold hot take. They're useful, but they're not going to be the thing that like fully replaces knowledge workers.
I have an observation about the way these things work that I would like you to coach me if you think I'm thinking about them incorrectly. It seems to me that the intelligence and reasoning and power of these tools in short bursts at the beginning of conversations, the way that we just described, reprompting, that is what is scaling. We are somewhere on an S curve there, like pretty far along on an S curve there.
Yep.
And while I keep seeing the specs of these new models raise the raise the context window, is such that I think it was recently Claude Opus 4.1 just hit a million token context window.
Yeah.
That's pretty big. Like, what is that in terms of I'm such a basic human. In terms of a book, what's 1 million tokens in terms of a book? A 300 page book?
No, it's more than that. I think it's like 2,000 pages of a book or something like that.
Okay.
So actually, let me do that let me just look that up real quick.
Yeah, while I'm fleshing this idea out, look that up for me. My question becomes, as those token windows have risen, the kind of total corpus of content that I can work with the LLM on seems to have grown, but it does not seem to have grown at the same rate. And by that I just mean I'm really using loosey-goosey terms here. Earlier versions of Claude or ChatGPT, I think
it was 1,500 pages is what I found. Sorry to interject, but yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. 1,500 pages. Earlier versions, I think ChatGPT 4.0 from memory, 128,000.
That sounds right.
Token content window.
Yeah. The ChatGPT 4X, 4.x class, the Sonnet 3.x class. Like I think they were all somewhere in the 128,000 token.
Okay.
Limit.
So theoretically, Claude Opus 4.1, as of time of recording, this is September 17th, 2025, has 1 million token context window. I find myself wanting more and more often to stuff the context with important information. So I'll give you an example. I'll be looking for, in my work, I'm trying to analyze hundreds of hours of transcripts of user interviews and user experience research documentation and look for patterns. And the old way of doing this would be to like roll tape and sit and watch hundreds of hours of content, which is very, very difficult for people to do. So, all right, let's take all of that content and let's stuff it into context. Now, here's a weird technical, it's not even technical, it's like a modality user experience product problem, right? Not every resource is available as a clean markdown file, right? So oftentimes I'm finding myself grabbing, for example, a PDF. And you and I both know from brutal experience that the range of the quality and structure and cleanliness and optimization and compression of PDFs can be insane, right? Like a PDF can be super clean XML with like really easy to extract text and structured data, or it can be like bitmap images of scanned pictures of pages of handwriting. And most people just say, oh, that's a PDF. But one of those is ludicrously more useful or available to an LLM's context, right? So in a chaotic world, in a chaotic working world, I look at something like Cloud Opus 4.1 and I say, holy smokes, I get 7 times more context than I used to. Here, take all the PDFs I have on this subject, right? Take all the user research, take all the business briefings, take all the scientific research papers I found online. I cannot tell you how often I find myself hitting the limit, right? Stuffing it into a project in ChatGPT
for over a million tokens.
Yeah.
Or 1.5 million tokens, whatever it
Yeah,
is.
where it gives an error and it says we can no longer continue this conversation. The context has gotten too long, or we cannot upload any more files into the project context. That's what I usually do. For those of you that haven't used them, ChatGPT and Claude both have this paradigm of a project where you can kind of quarantine context from other conversations and say, I'm working on a birthday present for Julian, and here's a bunch, and I'm going to constrain and upload a bunch of files and constrain the conversations to the birthday present for Julian, and I'm going to keep that separate of some other stuff. And so I often am dragging and dropping files, and it's giving me errors, file too large, you've run out of context window, delete some files. So I'm already wanting to push this much farther than I'm able to.
Mm-hmm.
And my sense is that my constraint and most humans' constraint is not context window. We're really, really good at that. It's time, right? If I had the time, if I had nothing else to do in my life, but to sit down and watch 120 hours of video recordings of user experience, of UX research, and I had a notebook and I were keeping with pen and paper, keeping notes or writing in a Google Doc, my reflections and my observations, maybe with some time code, maybe with some pull quotes, right? I would do a great job. A month later, you sit down with me in an interview and I'm able to speak with tremendous specificity and authority and comprehension of what we just did, right? Very long context window. My constraint is time, right? I don't have a month. I've got a lot of other stuff I've got to do. And I'm constantly hitting this wall of context window. So, and it doesn't seem to linearly scale with the numbers that are quoted in the specs. Like I don't, in my guts, feel like I get 7 times more context out of Opus 4.1 than I did with Claude Sonnet 3.5. Actually, let me put this in the form of a question. Based on what you know about the current generation large language models, does context window and performance scale together, or are these separate things to optimize for? And is it possible that the reasoning and the scoring on the bar exam or whatever these arbitrary and quantitative metrics that we rate LLMs against, is it possible that those start plateauing, but the context window continues to grow? Or are they tied together with an iron rope?
I think we've already seen that happen, right? I don't, sorry, to answer your question up front, I don't know. I'm not well versed enough in sort of like the internal architecture of an LLM to figure out whether or not how closely tied the context window is and the size of the context window is to the performance and how long it takes to process, the tokens in the context window to spit out a response. But just as a lay user of these things, I think we're and somebody who's read some of the benchmarks and what I've seen, we're already seeing that, right? Like the improvements are flattening out even as the context window grows much larger than it used to be. So there's a decoupling there of some kind. I don't know what that means. And then let me double check what you mean by performance. What kind of performance are you describing? Are you talking about accuracy and quality of the output? Are you talking about how fast it produces that output? Are you talking about how resource intensive it is to produce that output? There's a bunch of different measures you could be talking about too.
I don't know how many tokens would be representative of every email I've ever sent or received in my entire life.
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine it is astronomical. An LLM that could keep every email I've sent or received in my entire life in context and answer any questions like a search engine with reasoning and comprehension would be an amazing tool, even if it never got any smarter than the current generation of LLMs.
I think what you're describing, I mean, there's ways to do what you're describing, right? Like with current generation LLMs. How good they are is a question, and how accurate they can be is a question. But like, there's versions of this that work already with like RAG, which if you don't know what RAG, what's it's retrieval augmented generation, right? It's basically the idea that like, hey, you don't need to so for any given prompt, you don't to get a good answer, you don't need to shove every piece of content that you have at your disposal into the context window in order to get a good output. You just need to get the relevant context into the context window. And how you do that is like, there's some of it that's pretty basic stuff that already exists that's not all that groundbreaking. Like, you can literally just have a normal full text search that pulls up documents that may be relevant to the query. Like, you would just literally, like, the LLM, you might ask the LLM, what did I order from Amazon 2 weeks ago? And, rather than like literally loading every single email that is in your that's you've ever received in your life into the LLM in order to answer that question, you might run a full text search that says just Amazon orders, and then with a date range. And then you would put those into the context window, and then the LLM will be able to answer based on those will be able to answer based on that context that is very deliberately injected to only contain the relevant information. So you can do that, but it's not a question. Like, it's not, and even humans don't even do that, right? Like, you don't literally have the full text of every single thing that you've ever learned in your head. You have a summary or an abstract representation of those things in your head, and you pull them up and you re-summarize them every time somebody asks you about them.
I have a folksy metaphor or analogy about this. It seems like there's something spooky in our brains that's optimized for this. Have you ever run into somebody that you know pretty dang well at like an airport in a random city, and it takes you far longer to remember their name than your history with them would suggest, because you never in a million years would have expected to see them at a random airport somewhere far away?
Well, not even. It takes me longer to remember their name. I will not remember their name. I could tell you everything about them. I could tell you where their kids go to school, but I will not be able to recall their name.
Isn't that some weird caveman form of retrieval augmented generation, though? That we are, when we meet someone where we expect to meet them in a work context, at a restaurant context, in a social context, in a geographic context, where I would imagine that some subconscious process is going on where we're purging unnecessary context and we are loading stuff that our brain expects us to need.
Well, I'd be hesitant to say like, yeah, that's just like RAG. But I mean, on the surface, it sounds like something like that's happening, right? Like, there's definitely deep recesses in our brain that we're reaching back into to like load into working memory so that you're ready. Like, there's a reason why, like, when you get distracted, it takes 15 minutes to ramp back up on what you were doing, because you got to reload the context window, right?
Yeah.
But I would also be equally not surprised if it like does not work at like it looks like that, but it absolutely does not work the way that a RAG pipeline and an LLM works.
Yeah. So should we be vibe coding?
I would say if you're having fun with a thing that your users are not going to rely on heavily, go nuts. If you have other people that are going to have to maintain your code afterwards, or that you work with, no, don't vibe code. Be very thoughtful about how you use your LLM.
I'm really interested in the ways that vibe coding has taught me more about how to communicate with you. Or to empathize with you, not as a human. I think we already did a good job of that, but in the specific context of particularly back-end coding. And what's weird is, like, I don't want to stop vibe coding, but I'm less excited than ever to push to production vibe coded code. Vibe code, I guess, is just what we would call it. I'm less excited than ever to push to production vibe code. I'm more excited than ever to keep experimenting and keep vibe coding, even privately, as an instructive tool for how things work, where the rough edges of things are, where the non-obvious pitfalls of things are, because I think it helps me communicate better with you. Do you think I'm imagining that?
I think, well, here's the thing. You're learning a lot more about actual software engineering from the act of vibe coding, because especially with me in the loop, because then I'm telling you like, yeah, no, that doesn't work. You need to redo that. What's tricky is that like, is this I have a hard time seeing non-technical people directly contributing to a code base without frustrating the engineers that actually have to architect the code base, because like past a certain point, it's sort of like, I don't actually know the principles behind why this is supposed to work this way. And unless I like actually learn them, which means by definition you have become a software engineer, then it's sort of just like, okay, here's an idea I had, but this is just the start of it, and you're gonna have to finish it. And you may have to just throw away what I did and then just implement the general idea of it without actually learning how to actually become a software engineer. I have a hard time believing that there's still a gap to bridge there that is not clear to me is bridgeable, either without much better tools that are better at better at understanding architecture and implementing those changes, or without the person who's using the LLM to write the code actually learning how to, real software engineering principles.
Yeah, it brings to mind that T app that came out a month or two ago, right? And it went viral. It was like a dating app of some kind, and it was vibe coded, and it like leaked 30,000 people's driver's license images on the internet.
Yeah,
which is like an incredibly catastrophic data.
Which to be clear, you can have software engineers make mistakes and have that still happen.
Yeah,
it's just much more likely with a vibe coded app because there's no one there. There's no safety net.
Well, there's not only no safety net, but there's also a very weird liability chain, right? Like there's no one to sue. There's no one to hold accountable. There's no one to.
I disagree with you. I disagree. Like if you vibe code and you do something that jeopardizes other people's privacy, you are liable. You can't say, oh, the LLM did it. It's like, no, you built the thing, and that's where the liability is. The computer can't be held liable. You're liable.
I understand. I think I miscommunicated there for a second. I think what I'm getting at here is what we're talking about right now. Basically, legal liability is maybe one of the biggest non-obvious barriers to entry. It's one of, I think, unclear legal liability is probably the biggest point of friction for mass adoption of production code for large language models. I think, which is interesting because it's a non-technical barrier. It's a non-technical point of friction. It's a legal one. It's a procedural or regulatory one, right? It's a human one. In a world where, to oversimplify, the boss can hire a coder, if the coder messes up and there's a data leak, that can be insured, the coder can be fired. There's a lot of layers of plausible deniability. And in the end, still, the boss sometimes gets his proverbial, I was going to say head chopped off. That's really violent. Gets fired, loses their job. In a world where in this utopian, every human on earth is a unicorn of one, right? Every human on earth has $1 billion app on their hands because of AI. If that comes with everyone on earth as a target of liability and data privacy issues, I can imagine a lot of people that maybe have the skills to vibe code $1 billion app and release it might pause for a second at the increased proportional liability that falls squarely on their shoulders. I don't know that I'm being clear. Is that clearer or is that weirder?
That actually, I don't know. I still don't see the distinction between, I don't see the, like, and this is kind of the thing, right? Like, I don't see the distinction between whether software was built by a human or an LLM. There is still a party that is going to take on the liability of releasing it into the wild and accepting people either money in exchange for a service that may or may not work. That's one form of liability, or accept people's private data in exchange for liability that it may result in a breach of some kind. Like, I guess I'm not really I'm not understanding the distinction you're drawing between a company taking on that or a person taking on that liability.
I think what I'm saying is, imagine a company with 10 people, 10 humans working at it, building a software product. And imagine a second company with one person making a similar software product, but that person is using large language models to, in this simple toy analogy, they're using themselves and agentic AI to equal the economic output and technical output of the team of 10 people, right? If at any point in the journey, in the team of 10 people, if one or more of those people are incompetent, malicious, etc., right? They can be replaced, and some degree of liability can be protected for. Sorry, this is a really nuanced and funky thought. Humor me on this, because I think I'm compressing context that you have, Julian, but if someone's listening, they might not know this. So from the outside, a non-obvious thing is in a corporate structure, there are clear rungs of liability, right? Legal and financial liability. And for example, being just a Joe Schmo employee at a company comes with some liability depending on what you do and depending on how good or bad or flagrant you are at doing your job.
There's liability in being negligent to the point where it's like, oh, leaving tech alone, right? Like if you close up for the night and forget to lock the door, you could be liable for being negligent and causing a loss to the business because somebody broke in because the door wasn't locked.
Yes. So that's like the first airlock, right? Is I'm just a Joe Schmo employee, airlock, right? And if I leave the door unlocked, I could be fired. That's about the worst thing that can happen to me, right? Like there are very few scenarios where a clerk at a bank forgets to lock the door and is like civilly liable for $1 billion loss. That doesn't really happen.
Theoretically, they are, but they're almost never.
Right.
In practice, that almost never happens.
Right. Next step up, management, right? You're like a director level or above. You manage a team of people. You are to some extent liable, right, for the performance of those people and the actions of those people. And if you know about, right, like if you're the manager of the bank and you are aware that your employee forgot to lock the door and you didn't coach them, correct them, help them, or try to avoid that problem, that's a next step of liability, right? Then you get to like the board and executive level where you actually have a fiduciary duty to disclose certain information or perform certain actions to protect shareholder value, et cetera, right? So there are these cascading levels of liability of a company. And in the scenario where someone fairly low on that totem pole does something wrong, either accidentally or deliberately, there is some amount of protection for people higher up that rung when they become aware of that deliberate or accidental mistake, problem. Once they become aware of it, if they take immediate action, it insulates them a little bit. Maybe not completely, and it depends on the thing that's done, right? And in a world where you compress that liability down, right? It's no longer 2 or 3 or 4 airlocks. You've got one person or 2 people, and they are assuming all of the risk. I think that changes some things about the operations.
I hear you. I think what you're describing is just the difference between like being an employee versus running your own business. Like to me that distinction isn't that different from each other, right? Like, yes, maybe if you hire software engineers and they do something wrong as an executive, you maybe are slightly protected from that. But at the end of the day, but you know what isn't protected and what is effectively exactly the same? The entity of the corporation is still liable, where it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who did it or who messed up in the structure. Maybe there's outside liability from shareholders towards the CEO if it's a particularly egregious like omission from a filing or something like that. But at the end of the day, the corporation is still also liable. So to me that doesn't change the equation all that much.
I disagree. I think that the ceiling of opportunity is not going to be raised until we have some new concept in the legal system of risk, liability, and autonomy for AI. And I think that day will come. I don't know if it's 1 year in the future or 100 years in the future, but I think you'll really start cooking with gas in terms of economic output of AI when AI can earn its own money, be liable for its own output, and exchange information, data, liability, risk, economic output, etc., with other humans, other corporations, and other AIs. And that is
how is that how is that functionally different than a subcontractor relationship?
I mean, it's functionally different in that you can hire a subcontractor and they are a human being that can do certain things and you can pay them money and they can execute contracts and they can succeed or fail.
But what you're advocating for is pretty much the same relationship with an AI.
Yeah.
So why is, I guess I don't really understand why you need a distinction. Like, why can't the AI just be a corporation then?
Because today you really only have two parties, right? You have the person or legal entity that's using the AI, and then
Yeah.
you've got the service provider, and their terms of service are, disavow liability
Well,
to.
okay, I think so. Then what you're describing is like you need the ability to. So if what you're saying is that there is a lack of the ability to hold a third party accountable if you release a thing that an AI put out that it ends up being harmful to your business or harmful to your customers, then that to me that says like, oh, we need stronger restrictions on companies that provide AI as a service. Like
That is
I don't see that as like what you're describing is more of that to me than it is like, oh, we need a whole different class of thing to define an AI by. Like it's still a
it's a gray area for me. Well, no, it's not so I think there's a difference between OpenAI assuming all liability of all of its agents and all of its language models, which would destroy their value. And I'm not saying it's not logical. What you're saying is logical. I think it is a vast shift from where the current state of the market is from a legal and technical perspective.
I agree, but I'm saying it to me. It doesn't sound like that's materially like what you're describing to me isn't materially different from like what you're describing. Like an AI that has its own money and has its own ability to execute contracts is just like one. Like how why doesn't it just have a corporate structure? Like why can't an AI just have a corporate structure and then it's a subcontractor to you?
I mean,
Like
when humans are born, why aren't they issued a corporation in their name?
they do. That's the sole proprietorship.
I'm not sure that that's how that works, but let me do some homework on that. And this is, I think, a fruitful conversation.
Yeah, by definition, you can start. You don't need anybody's permission to accept money for your services, right? Like you can just start doing it as a sole proprietor.
Of course, but sole proprietors, limited liability companies, corporations have different rights and responsibilities associated with them.
Sure.
And individual humans that are engaging in activity, including but not limited to business work, professional work.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a big topic and I'm not trying to be flippant. I think it's very interesting, but it gets very science fiction-y, right? It's like we already have this fundamental tension in our legal system and in our society, at least in the United States, of the tension between people and corporations, right? Like corporations are people that can't die. People are people that can die. Like that's pretty much, corporations are people that can split, duplicate, replicate, merge.
Wait, hold on. Corporations die all the time.
They can't be executed by the state.
Yes, they 100% can.
But
they're never that power is almost never executed, but they can be.
I am not aware of a single corporation that has ever been forcibly terminated by any state actor.
So a forced sale to another entity that effectively removes the existence of the corporation.
There's still a successor.
That's like inheritance. That's like another entity that like it dies, and then that's the inherent destiny.
My point is that there's a lot of tension in our society.
It stops existing.
Cultural and legal. There's a lot of tension in our culture around the delineation between people and corporations.
And you want to add a third one, is what you're saying.
We are already adding a third one without being thoughtful about it, is what I'm saying.
I don't know. I'm not. Let's just say I'm not. I haven't been swayed by your argument. So
well,
if we can keep talking about it, but it just seems we can keep talking about it later. But my current, as formulated, I don't really understand how it's functionally different from just another corporation.
I didn't intend to make an argument, so it's not well thought out or well researched. But if it's interesting, maybe I will. And maybe I will try to persuade you and get a lot more granular and specific. Because I'm very confident there is something misaligned here. I'm not confident I have or anyone has an answer to the misalignment, but I'm very confident that there's a misalignment here. And it's one that will become proportionately more and more problematic the more economic activity we delegate to non-human technology.
So if you want to get really weird, there's the discussion that like it's still software, and software in general and open source software in particular is just fundamentally incompatible with the concept of capitalism.
That is a fire sentence for our next episode, I think. Is software incompatible with capitalism? All right.